Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, first, the Australian government proposed bringing in a law to make tech giants pay for content from news organisations. Then Facebook and Google fought back, claiming it was unfair and, quotes, fundamentally misunderstands how social media platforms publish news. But while Google backed down and signed a multi-year deal with News Corp, Facebook last night blocked news reaching its Australian users. Now Australia's Prime Minister has attacked the social media platform, branding it arrogant, and said his government would not be intimidated into abandoning the law. Millie Stevenson has this report.
Facebook has hit the nuclear button in its standoff with the government.
News this morning, social media giant Facebook has followed through on its threat.
The country woke up today to find most Australian news pages were just a blank space.
Who runs the world, global tech giants or governments? As we speak, a high-stake bargaining war between Facebook and the Australian administration is raging over the future of news and who pays for it. Australia woke up to the news that there was no news on Facebook because the social network blocked people from viewing and sharing it.
Facebook was wrong.
This is an assault on a sovereign nation.
They're behaving more like North Korea.
Or in the words of the country's PM, ironically posting on Facebook that their actions were to unfriend Australia, cutting off essential health information at the height of the pandemic.
The reaction in Australia has been one of absolute shock, outrage and anger, because Facebook has not just cut off news services, Facebook has cut off government authorities, it's cut off public services. And this is critical when you consider the amount of natural emergencies that happen in Australia and also the rollout of the COVID vaccine.
Now, Facebook would say they were pushed into this decision by the Australian government, but do you think it's irresponsible of them to take this action?
It's shown the Australian public just how much control they do have over their social news feeds, but it's also showing the media companies ahead of any bargaining it may then go on to do just how powerful it is. So it's a high stakes game. Who's going to blink first is not really clear at this stage.
So how did we get here? How long have you got? Well, in short, while most of us get our news online, the global tech giants are getting rich on advertising money. In Australia, more than 80% of online ad revenue goes to Facebook and Google, and that share is increasing all the time, while more local and longer-standing news publishers are shrinking and disappearing. So the Australian government say they want to make it a more level playing field and are bringing in a new law which makes big tech companies pay for news content shown on their site. They say to protect public interest journalism.
I love people's faces.
And this Facebook ad promising to support communities in the pandemic has not aged well. The social network accused today of being more anti-social network after announcing it has left us facing a stark choice: attempt to comply with a law that ignores the realities of this relationship, or stop allowing news content on our services in Australia. With a heavy heart, we are choosing the latter. While the social network have blocked professional news sites, meanwhile fake news and misinformation on Australia's vaccine rollout continue to spread on Facebook. So how has this news gone down under?
I think Facebook banning news is terrible, actually. I do use Facebook. It seems to be a catch-all.
They're so big and so widely used by Australians that people will just revolt against it.
While Google had threatened to make its search engine unavailable in Australia too, but have now agreed to pay Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, among others. Big tech companies have the power to play hardball at the moment and fear this law could set an expensive precedent around the world.
Are Facebook acting a bit more like a totalitarian regime than a big tech here, taking this action in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, Facebook apparently are reinstating some of these pages. The government's not backing down at all, which I think is a mistake. In fact, our Prime Minister's just gone to leaders of the world to ask them to support them in this rather antique version of a media code. And so it'll be interesting to see if they do get the backing. I don't believe that they will. But we'll see. But both sides are behaving extremely badly. This is not going to end well for Australians in general.
Facebook's critics think this is a case of Silicon Valley getting too big for their boots. Their argument: social networks may have changed the world, it doesn't mean they run it.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Julian Knight, who chairs the Commons Digital, Culture and Media and Sport Committee, and began by asking him what he thought of Facebook's actions in Australia.
I think it's crass. I think it's bullying, and in the middle of a pandemic, to not only just take down news feeds, which denies the public trusted news sources, but also to take down, admittedly they say by mistake, charity websites, charity pages and government information pages is, in my view, very irresponsible.
What do you think we in Britain should be thinking then about how we should legislate around social media?
What I'm most encouraged about is the fact that we're looking from a competition angle, because the Competition and Markets Authority is looking at social media companies and precisely how they work within the economy and society. And I think that is really helpful, because these companies have a huge power across so many different markets. And ultimately, they all have one thing in common. They make huge amounts of money from other people's work, whether that be journalism in Australia or music streaming in the UK. And one does feel that at the moment, the cards are stacked against creatives and those who are putting in the hard yards, and in favour of the social media companies.
So do you think Britain should also be considering laws to make social media companies pay for news content?
I do think that there needs to be equitable remuneration for music providers, for video sharing, for good journalism, which we want to encourage in a world of disinformation and fake news. However, the way you get there may not be the Australian way. But what Facebook has done is effectively pick a fight with Australia in order to say to the rest of the world, well, we will, frankly, do what we want, and we will wave a big stick if we don't agree with the legislation you're bringing forwards. And that is against all they've been saying in the last 3 years.
I mean, isn't this modern day warfare, really, between a private corporation and a state? Now, if Australia was in conflict, was in physical conflict with any other body, other countries in the world, including Britain, would be thinking about coming to their aid.
Yeah, they've unfriended a continent, effectively. And you have a really good point there. The fact is that these supranational organisations, these conglomerates, these huge global players across borders, they are incredibly useful and incredibly enterprising, but they have huge consequences for our society. Because the truth of the matter is that the likes of Facebook, if they browbeat Australia, we're next. And other countries will be next when we try and bring forward legislation which we think protects society and also ensures that they're good players in society and that there is a fair and level playing field when it comes to competition. So we've got to send a message of support to our friends in Australia that although they may feel as if they are the victims of a punishment beating almost from a global brand, at the same time, they are in the right in the fact that democratic institutions should have the power in order to limit the role, even of Facebook.
Julian Knight, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I then spoke to Shoshana Zuboff, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Business School and author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I began by asking what governments around the world should be thinking as they look at what Facebook has done in Australia.
International governments, especially the world's liberal democracies, should be thinking this is a wake-up call, because we are living in a world right now where a group of surveillance empires dominate the digital world. There has been no democratic law to stop them. They've declared private ownership over all of our personal data. They have declared absolute control over critical information systems and infrastructure. They have control and authority over the world's knowledge and information and the systems and infrastructures that carry that knowledge and information. If they want to turn it off, they can turn it off. If they want to tweak it, they can tweak it. If they want to put it back on, they can put it back on. They can do whatever they want. Why? because for the last 20 years, while they've been developing these capabilities, our democracies have been sleepwalking. So the rest of us are marching naked now into this digital century.
So what sort of laws would be appropriate?
We need laws that put our personal information back under our control. Our personal lives have always been regarded as inalienable. These are sovereign rights of the individual, but they've simply usurped those rights. And you know, the battle that's going on right now in Australia is a battle that began in 1997 when the young Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who of course were the founders of Google, decided to crawl the web and take all websites and rank them in their new search engine. And you know, those website owners were angry, and they were calling Stanford University, where these young men were students, and they were complaining and they were threatening lawsuits. But the two young men decided to ignore the complaints. They just kept taking. And honestly, that kind of set the template for the world that we have come to inherit. We have a lot to dial back because, of course, they did the same thing to journalism. And that has left us vulnerable to the scourge of disinformation that really is tearing our societies apart.
But are they too big to actually take on now?
Only democracy has the countervailing power to take on these huge corporations. So our challenge is, how do we reclaim the digital and digital technology for democracy and for society, so that we can actually get on with our lives and look forward to the democratization of knowledge and solving all kinds of, you know, really big problems that the digital century was supposed to offer us. The hard and harsh truth here, Krishnan, is that as we move into this third decade of our digital century, we have a critical question to ask ourselves. We can have a surveillance society, or we can have a democracy. It is literally impossible for us to have both. We decide how we're going to be governed in a democracy. Facebook can do whatever it wants. So can Apple, so can Google, so can Microsoft, so can Amazon. It's unaccountable power. Today, we are all Australians, and every government is the Australian government, because we all face this unaccountable power in exactly the same way. It's time for democracy to wake up, and we together, citizens and lawmakers, build the infrastructures of laws and rights that we need to tether all of this to fundamental rights, tether it to public service, and make this digital century safe for democracy.
Shoshana Zuboff, thank you very much indeed.
You are very welcome, Krishnan. Thanks for having me.
Now, Facebook built its world on likes and friendship. Now, Australia's government, having taken a stance against large technology companies not paying for news, has said the company has unfriended the whole country. Australian Facebook users are waking up to find all local and global news sites are unavailable through the network. This is because the tech giant is reacting to a proposed law that would make companies like it and Google pay for news content on their platforms. In the ultimate big tech versus the government battle, who will win? Who has the power? Joining me now is the author and professor at Harvard Business School, Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana, are you in any way sympathetic for Facebook doing this?
No, I would not say that's where my sympathies lie.
Tell us why not.
Well, look, the conflict that's playing out in Australia now really reflects a larger showdown between the unaccountable power of the tech companies and the world's liberal democracies. The big question that's in neon in the background here is whether or not we are going to have a digital century in which democracy can thrive. And of course, a thriving democracy means a robust, flourishing fourth estate. It's essential as a source of reliable information that strives to be true, and journalism is the only profession dedicated to that objective. You literally cannot have a stable society without it.
But in terms of, just to look at what's happened here, and then we can zoom out again, if Facebook is not allowing access to those sites. Are you not worried about what's going to fill the gap?
Well, you know, there's going to be if it remains this way, you know, there's going to be a transition, and we've got to get a re-triggering of our mindsets. The information from the news publications, or whether it's a public health site, I know there's been concern about vaccination information and other public health information. That information exists. You go to the website of that organization or of that newspaper, and that information is there. So it's not a question of having lost the information. It's a question of Facebook is now revealing that it has, like the other big tech companies, total, absolute control over critical information systems and infrastructure, critical to communications, critical to social participation, and it is flexing its muscles in a kind of showdown with democracy, which for the last 2 decades, you know, democracy has been pretty nicely taking a nap. There has been no law to really impede the growth of Facebook and Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple's power. But democracies are waking up now.
On that point, though, if you're looking at what Australia are doing, do you then see it as a model for the rest of the world? Because, you know, some could say, you know, building on your point about democracy taking a nap, well, the cat's already out of the bag. They're too big to regulate.
Yeah, that's not true. In my view, you know, that's what they want us to believe. Look, the big tech companies operate with an economic logic I call surveillance capitalism. It's shown itself to be a threat to people and to democracy. But this thing is only 20 years old. Democracy is a lot older. We have faced big threats before. We have faced dangerous industries before. And we have found a way to bring those industries into democracy's house, to live under the rule of law, to obey our fundamental rights and the laws that we have to oversee those rights. Nothing is exempt, nothing should be exempt. What's happened is for the last 20 years, our liberal democracies, not just Britain or Australia or the United States, but really all of them, have failed to develop that vision and design and way of deploying the digital that would make it compatible with democracy and that would lead to a digital future where democracy would thrive. You know, the Chinese have been doing that in order to create a digital future for their own form of authoritarian government. But we failed to do the same. And these companies have filled the void
what do you
with
see,
their own economics.
What do you then see as the solution? I mean, this is one start, if you like, in Australia, one idea, but if you can, to summarise.
Yes, absolutely. The solution is that democracy is once again on the move. We're seeing it in Australia, in this and other activities in Australia. We're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in the EU, and we're seeing it in America, which has been a little bit slow to come to the party, but we're seeing it now. We're seeing new conversations, not only about antitrust, but about rights, about legislation, about new oversight institutions. This is the kind of work that we did in the 19th and 20th century to make industrial capitalism safe for democracy. And this is the work that falls upon us now. And the third decade, I believe, is when democracy is going to turn this thing around and reclaim the digital for people, for society, for solving the urgent problems that we really hoped to be able to finally get to grips with in this digital century.
Shoshana Zuboff, thank you.